my video here. I'm just recording myself, so don't worry. All right, so thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here at ICES and present to you my current research project. So it's the subject of a DFG grant proposal, for the writing of which I was lucky enough to receive a fellowship at the EUF. My thanks thus goes to the Presidium, especially to Professor Peter Hering, for choosing my proposal, but also to the American Studies Department and Professor Birgit Davis and my colleagues there for graciously hosting my ideas. And of course to ICES and here especially to Dr. Maria Schwab for all her help with the grant proposal. So to start things off, let me set the stage. So I'm a researcher of science fiction, and that is not a trivial matter. Though many canon discussions will have you believe so. To clarify, I'm mostly interested in questions of technological development and how they are represented in culture. My dissertation dealt with genetics and how culture appropriates certain narratives as a form of commentary on techno-utopian futures and neoliberal individualism. Interestingly, the narrative that our genetic makeup is programmable like a computer and that desirable genetic traits can be switched on or off is a misconception of scientific reality, and one that keeps being used in popular culture on genetics. The gene as code metaphor is at the heart of many of the critiques of, for example, the mRNA vaccines that I've heard. The fear that people have is that the shot might rearrange their DNA and switch on certain traits that they will then pass on to their children, which is why younger women don't want it because they're afraid that they will pass it on to their children. So this, of course, is complete fiction. Unfortunately, it has been used in fiction, and that is where a lot of people get their ideas from. And that, dear colleagues, is where the cookie crumbles, as they say. So let's put it this way. Aside from genetics and, of course, climate change, and those are huge issues in themselves, there are a lot of challenges in science and technology that are quite hard to grasp for the majority of people. For the project, and this has been my field of research over the last few years, I am looking towards issues of digital change. Science and technology in the field of the digital is overwhelmingly complex, and it is ubiquitous. And even though politicians seem to think we cannot just not deal with it, digital technology will touch us all. It will entangle us, it will change our lives forever. I would go so far and argue that the digital technologies are what Timothy Morton calls hyperobjects. So for Morton, hyperobjects are beyond human recognition in scale. We cannot possibly grasp their complexity and size and thus have to simplify them to make sense of them. He calls them viscous in that they stick to our lives, that we cannot get rid of them or ignore them. We can only ever see expressions of them so long as we log. So when we log in to Facebook or Twitter, we see manifestations of big data and social media, but we do not really see the global project or the global object of a platform economy that is behind this. So Morton writes, every attempt to pull myself free by some act of recognition renders me more hopelessly stuck to hyperobjects. In his book Dark Ecology, he writes about climate change as a hyperobject and how we as human beings are both too small a cog in the system to know our place and yet still participating in our own suicide by climate catastrophe. It is worth quoting at length to understand how a hyperobject is both right there with us and yet ungraspably far away. So Morton writes, there you are, turning the ignition of your car, and it creeps up on you. You are a member of a massively distributed thing. This thing is called species. Yet the difference between the weirdness of my ignition key twist and the weirdness of being a member of the human species is itself weird. Every time I start my car or a steam engine, I don't mean harm to Earth, let alone cause the 6th mass extinction event in the 4.5 billion year history of this planet. Furthermore, I'm not harming Earth. My key turning is statistically meaningless, and in an individual sense, this turn isn't weird at all. But go up a level, and something very strange happens. When I scale up these actions to include billions of key turnings and billions of coal shovelings, harm to Earth is precisely what is happening. I am responsible as a member of the species for the Anthropocene. Of course, I'm formally responsible to the extent that I understand global warming. That's all you actually need to be responsible for something. You understand that this truck is going to hit that man, you're responsible for that man. Yet in this case, formal responsibility is strongly reinforced by causal responsibility. I am the criminal, and I discover this via scientific forensics. Just like in a noir fiction, I am the detective and the criminal. I am a person, I am also part of an entity that is now a geophysical force on a planetary scale. And wait. No. There we are. So when I say that the digital transformation of our society is a hyperobject, I am referring to this feeling of being somehow part of it and yet somehow not. When you log on to Facebook, you're connecting with your friends, but you're also part of a $1 trillion economy based on data as a commodity. When you call a service line and an automated system directs your queries, you are part of the process of automation that is challenging all industries at once. The famous 2013 Frey and Osborne Oxford study determined that it is more likely than not to be automated out of a job. Digital transformation is already upon us, whether we like to think about it or not. Think about it. When the pandemic hit, it was our phones that allowed tracking of where we were and whom we had contact with. It was our metadata that allowed for mobility indexes and risk assessment. It was digital technologies like this one we're using right now that allowed productivity to remain in many sectors of the economy. The digital transformation is all around us. Well, maybe not the Gesundheitsamt and its fax machines, but you know what I mean. So, what does all of this have to do with science fiction, you ask? Well, I will inform you in two parts. First, what does all of this have to do with fiction? I mean, all media forms of fiction, not just literature. But literature provides the theoretical basis, so it might as well be my example. Fiction is a representation of reality, a model of reality, if you will. It is not a lie or a deception, but rather a representation of possible actions, relations, and states. Fiction describes our reality to a certain point. I would refer you to either Borges or Baudrillard to discuss the possibility of how closely fiction can actually map our reality. But for my purposes here, so when the sentence is, we went to our favorite restaurant for dinner that evening is found in a novel, we as readers can reasonably assume how the evening went, even though the level of detail is pretty low. The sentence presents us with a lot of ellipses. On a technical level, the protagonists arrived at the restaurant, they sat down, chose and ordered food, and it came sometime after, they ate it, then they will have paid for it, the service, and left the restaurant. There are many other things that could have happened, but here the sentence is too abstract for a description of an individual visit. It shortens the event to its basic components, and we assume no deviations from the norm. But in all, the sentence is no lie, it does not deceive us, but rather allows us to find meaning in its reference to norms and conventions of restaurant visits. So in its simplicity, it is a low-grade model of a visit to a restaurant. So even if the characters in this particular novel are not real, the restaurant might not be either, yet the actions undertaken are authentic, they represent actions taken in reality, science fiction or fictional models of reality. And even more so, fictions impact our expectations because we recognize them as models of behavior. We believe that what happens in fiction is a model for reality. So when people in Germany first experience a courtroom, a lot of us will wait for the moment that a shout of objection will arise. Alas, that will not happen, as our model for reality, in this case, is based on a cultural idiosyncrasy of the US justice system. Germans don't do that. So fictions do determine our expectations of reality, though. So, and I swear it's only for a few minutes, but so to be a literary scholar for a minute, the effect that fiction and reality are mirrors of each other is called mimesis. Mimetic representation of events is what is usually and colloquially called realistic. When fiction is realistic, we normally mean that everything happening in the story could happen as it is based in our reality. So when people fall in love and get on each other's nerves when they interact, all of that is based on the conventions of how people act in reality. Realistic fiction is mimetic in that it tries to model our world as closely as possible. But what happens when we want to model more complex objects? When we want to model stuff that is beyond normal human experience? Such as, for example, the climate catastrophe, or the changes that digital technologies will bring. And that, returning to the idea of what this has to do with my project, is what science fiction can do. I contend that for hyperobjects, for the complexities of new technologies and their social impact, science fiction is a great vehicle to mimetically represent this. And yes, this would be the moment when literary scholars usually protest that science fiction is anything but mimetic. But let me explain. So literary scholar So-Young Chu actually argues the opposite, that science fiction is highly energetic in terms of mimesis and thus modeling the world. SF to Chu is not the antithesis of mimetic high art literature. Far from it. It is a mimetic form that represents aspects of reality that are hard to grasp and reconcile with her own cognitive abilities, or what she calls cognitively estranging reference. Whenever reference are not completely cognitively accessible to us, they need a higher energy to be made mimetic. So Chu explains that there is a spectrum whose two limits are reference wholly accessible to cognition and wholly estranging reference. One end of the spectrum is populated by concrete objects highly susceptible to understanding and amenable to representation. These include softballs, paintbrushes, oak leaves, dimes, apple blossoms, almonds, and pencils. Realism and naturalism are extremely capable of representing such objects. The other end of the spectrum is occupied by reference virtually unknowable, reference that all but defy human language and comprehension. These would include the infinitely remote future, the infinitely remote past, and whatever lies on the other side of death. Mimetic accounts of such reference exist nowhere, not even in science fiction. In the middle of that spectrum, though, are objects that are cognitively estranging, that is, the sublime, outer space, virtual entities like cyberspace, realities imperceptible to the human brain like the fourth dimension, phenomena whose historical contexts have not yet been fully realized, such as robot rights, and events so overwhelming that they escape immediate experience, like shell shock. Representing these objects with realistic forms of fiction is not possible in full, thus they need higher literary energy to be mimetically represented. And that is what science fiction does. SF is a form of mimesis, I would argue, when reality reference are too complex for human experience. And it might be argued that this is the case in a lot of issues at stake in our 21st century. Chu argues, for example, that in a highly mediatized world, the boundaries between virtual and material existence blur as digital technologies become ubiquitous. Other examples of estranging reference would be realities of the late capitalist globalized economy with its too big to fail banks or financial systems, the data-driven economy of social media. We already talked about the realities of the global climate catastrophe and the inevitable self-harm of our own behavior. But we could technically also argue that the lived realities of minorities and socially marginalized groups are cognitively estranging reference. When the LGBTQ community or Black Lives Matter have continued to fight for a safely livable world in which their own being is constantly being threatened. So these are all reference on which fictional realism can only provide localized and very individual responses. But the hyper-object quality of these issues goes unrepresented. So, to allow for a quick intermission, my argument is that science fiction is a form of cultural representation that allows us to mimetically represent hyper-objects. Reference too complex that fictional realism can only ever produce localized and individualized accounts of. But science fiction, with its high energy mimetic output, is able to provide imaginaries of hyper-objects that our cognition can grasp. Science fiction makes hyper-objects recognizable to us in their entirety. And it seems to me that a lot of the things we are facing in current reality are hyper-objects. Issues such as climate crisis, a pandemic like COVID, the social inequalities experienced by millions, or the digital transformations that are coming rapidly at us. Before I turn everything on its head, let me explain what I mean by example. So in the film Elysium, director Neil Blomkamp explores a few hyper-objects at the same time, or let's say he tries to represent the conglomerate of them as they interact today. The film is set in the year 2154, and its intro sequence already explores how automation and the climate crisis have exacerbated the social situation, further entrenching inequalities. So let's see if this video works. And don't worry about the sound. You don't need the sound actually. So the camera takes us across a river delta, polluted with industrial refuse, a wasteland that already sets the mood. The shot tracks across the city, buildings crowding in on each other, everything is in very poor condition. In the intertitle, we are informed of the state of the world and how climate migration has led to an even worse overpopulation. In the background, the usual grid of American cities has been replaced by the urban chaos of ramshackle buildings. While we ponder which slum of the global south this might be, the cut shows us skyscrapers. A recognition creeps in. The US Bank Tower and Citibank Tower confirm this is the Los Angeles skyline. Anecdotally, Blomkamp filmed this sequence in Mexico City, the message thus being that global warming and climate migration will eventually make Los Angeles as hot and overcrowded in a few years' time. Another cut and we are off planet. Rich folks have left for the better world. The ring station Elysium with its wealthy states, lush greens and clear blue lakes. This is the extrapolation of today's gated communities, an elite power fantasy of being untouched by the consequences of climate crisis. And you only have to look to Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk and these other guys to see that this is exactly where they're headed. They're thinking of, if this planet burns to a cinder, let's please make us a nice little station upstairs where we can sit this one out. So the plot of the film centers on this social conflict and uses the day laborer Max as the catalyst for change. Max works in a factory that builds robots who incidentally have taken over all other jobs. He is literally building his own replacements in terms of job security. The film highlights how precarious his position is, several times threatening to replace him if he doesn't comply or ever more outrageous demands. The pivotal scene is a malfunction in the radiation chamber which stops production. To not lose money, his boss orders him inside and Max gets lethally irradiated. No safety procedures, no regulation that would help him. He is sent home with hospice medication and immediately replaced with another day laborer. The rest of the plot is action. Max decides to fight for his life, forces his way onto Elysium, and is able to reprogram the computer to see everyone on Earth as citizens of Elysium in the need of help, which the AI then complies with, sending humanitarian aid to Earth. The film thus comments on a spectrum of issues and the consequences of the climate catastrophe and overpopulation and limited resources, and on the reality of social inequality, driven by automation and hypercapitalist interest. The film mimetically represents the underlying ethical issues that our economies face regarding automation, and which sociologist Peter Frays argues as such: the existence of a large pool of unemployed and low-wage workers operates as a disincentive for employers to automate. After all, why replace a worker with a robot if the worker is cheaper? Will we as societies continue to put financial interests of the few ahead of the need of the many? Do we challenge the global capitalist order or do we ride it out to the end? For Frays, this is the key issue, the question of how we end up tackling the massive inequality of wealth, income and political power in the world today. And of course what follows from this. Blomkamp seems to agree, as the film shows a world that Frays would describe as exterminist, in which the majority of the population is seen as surplus that can be sacrificed for wealth and comfort of the economic elites. In the end, though, when the AI has become aware of the suffering on Earth and acts to help, it becomes obvious that another future is possible, one which Frays would describe as communist, in the sense that all share the benefits of automated production, not just the powerful. Oops. Yeah, there we go. No. My PowerPoint, hang on. There we go, sorry. In summary then, a science fiction film such as Elysium can represent to us complex issues such as the interconnected reality of a globalized and automated economy, the climate crisis and its consequential migration, and the massive social inequality that drives our current system. I believe that this is the benefit of science fiction as mimetic art form, and that none other can replicate. All right, so finally, returning to the idea of my project, Popular Imaginaries of the Digital as Science Communication, or PopSci, as I lovingly call it. If science fiction is able to mimetically represent cognitively estranging reference, and then it stands to reason that audiences will see science fictional imaginaries as representations of aspects of reality. As with the idea of courthouse behavior or going to a restaurant, the images and abstractions produced by science fiction will be read as a form of mimesis. Mind you, this is not a one-on-one causal relation, so more like a general tendency that is repeated over, the more you see specific imaginaries, the more they can actually influence public perception. So this is especially important in issues of science and technology that are, as we've seen, complex, continuously changing, and massively impacting our social constitution. So take, for example, RoboMark here, a meme that plays with science fictional ideas on several levels. So first, Mark has never been a normal specimen of the human species. His performances in front of Congress, for example, have many times been related to him being a robot. The red laser pointer eye, though, makes him a specifically threatening form of robot, a Terminator. Similarly, the logo of his new brand Meta has been set next to the logo from Skynet, the evil AI that wages war on humans in the Terminator series. The cultural imaginary of Skynet and Terminators is 40 years old, and yet it pops up into our minds whenever public discourse even touches upon an issue like artificial intelligence, or even more widely, whenever radical digital technology is evoked. So for those of you nerdy enough, here's another ironic note. Mark Zuckerberg himself, in his vision of the metaverse, which he announced in this video, is bluntly stealing from completely misrepresenting the idea from Neil Stephenson, whose metaverse is more like an anarchic digital playground in which everybody can build their own little worlds, which surely wasn't a sanitized and corporate-owned simulacrum of reality. But that's an irony that's probably lost on Mr. Zuckerberg. So let me try to put it another way. The imaginary of Skynet and the Terminators is so pervasive that it continues to haunt nearly every discussion of artificial intelligence 40 years on. Here are just a few headlines picked from this year's news alone, and you can see the term Skynet or Terminator popping up in basically every one of them. Public discourse on artificial intelligence gets bogged down by the fictional images of robots killing humans from a science fiction B-movie from the 1980s. So short anecdote, we had a seminar on technological challenges and we showed the movie Ex Machina, which is also part of the robot is indistinguishable from humans and robot kills humans imaginaries. So both of them actually are picked up in this. Afterwards, we discussed actual robotic research with a colleague from the field, from the TU in Hamburg. And he gave a long rant on how all of those Hollywood images are not the reality in the field. How it would benefit us all if we better understood the potential and the limits of machine learning. Because what we think AI is just not going to happen for the next, I don't know how many decades, if at all. So if Skynet was there in the discussion, nonetheless, even with a different film, we talked about Skynet and the Terminators. And scientists in the field have to address this giant in the room. It's just not possible to ignore this. So PopSci wants to address this giant and see it for what it is. It is a form of science communication. Whenever new technologies are represented in popular culture, it communicates that science to the public, for better or for worse. So unfortunately, most scientific institutions do not consider science fiction a valid form of representation. And judging from the reaction in my technology seminar, there is still a lot of resentment and misunderstanding about what SF does. So when advances in machine learning are communicated via academic papers, press conferences, and science reporting, it will reach far fewer people than the images created by popular culture. So imaginaries of robots and AI as a threat to human survival are a form of science communication, and digital science needs to address this. Problem is, we first need to understand what images are produced, how nuanced they are, and what the cultural work is that they actually do. So, even more so, we need to understand that these imaginaries are neither monolithic nor separate from ideological positions. For example, the images you see here are from US Hollywood variety of, Terminator, iRobot, RoboCop. And they're repeated actually in British productions like Robot Overlords or Black Mirror. All of them display robots as a threat to human life, as a competition species that will fight us for domination. In a very insightful essay, SF author Ted Chiang has argued that this specific image of AI, the domination image, can best be explained as one that is based in how our capitalist system works, especially for the tech company monopolists that are currently developing AI. So after Elon Musk had warned that even a benign AI designed to grow and pick strawberries could actually cultivate the earth as a strawberry field and thus eradicate all humanity in the process, Chiang asks us to consider who pursues their goals with monomaniacal focus, oblivious to the possibility of negative consequences? Who adopts a scorched earth approach to increasing market share? This hypothetical strawberry-picking AI does what every tech startup wishes it could do, grows at an exponential rate and destroys its competitors until it's achieved an absolute monopoly. So AI then might become what we fear because we have already established the baseline for what we fear. Chiang argues when Silicon Valley tries to imagine superintelligence, what it comes up with is a no-holds-barred capitalism. So one might ask, if this is true then, Hollywood's imaginaries of the digital might be slightly ideologically driven by this hegemonic position. Are there no other imaginaries that might actually counter this? Yes, there are. So my argument, and something that I would like to further investigate in PopSci, is that yes, indeed, one can find other imaginaries. Science fiction can tell different stories, and it is important to note how they counteract the hegemonic discourse, what cultural work these imaginaries do. So take, for example, the independently produced Robot and Frank, which displays an artificial intelligence that not only takes on the necessary care work of an elderly dementia patient, but also gains his trust and friendship by overcoming its programmed labor schedule. Automation here fills the need that society cannot cater to. The film thus becomes an important piece of science communication, transporting meaningful images of how important automation can be in understaffed sectors such as care work. And at the moment, they're understaffed. We could actually use some robots taking care of people at the moment. So issues such as the social need for automation in sectors such as care work have fallen victim to a gap in science communication because of the Terminator image. So similarly, in the German production Ich bin dein Mensch, Alma is a test subject for an AI company designed specifically to address the romantic needs of singles and prevent isolation and loneliness, another aspect related to our work lives and the need for care. Alma first rejects Tom, the robot, on the basis that all experiences with him are fictitious, because Tom is programmed to make Alma happy. But in the end, Alma realizes that Tom has a different but similarly valid humanity of his own, a statement that places the film in a very different imaginary, one in which robots become equals to humans because they possess similar traits. That the film is European and displays a very different variety of imaginary is key to my argument in PopSci, which hypothesizes that hegemonic structures in regards to economy, policy, and society are important aspects of what kind of cultural impact science fiction as science communication has. The project wants to analyze the differences of representation of digital science and technology between the Anglo-centric discourses, which are shaped by much stronger neoliberal, individualistic, and competitive framework, versus the European discourse, which can be argued to be built on a more social democratic understanding of economy, international cooperation and compromise, and more regulatory hands-on states. If there are in fact different hegemonic frames applied to science, then its science communication should also differ noticeably. So, to round off this presentation, let me shortly define the scope of the project and become more specific as to what I want to do. First, let me recap what I consider the issues subsumed as imaginaries of the digital. You can find them here on the slide. It will, of course, be necessary to find groupings for these topics, because those would be too much, right? If I were to write a book on, I don't know, 10 different chapters, that might be a bit harsh. So I would have to group these, and I don't want to do this up front. I want to do this when I see the data. I believe it's actually easier to identify these once these have been analyzed and tagged. So I think there will be parts which actually work together. PopSci is calculated to last 3 years and address the following research objectives. 1, to formulate a rhetorics of representation of digital technologies by extrapolating narrative and visual patterns in contemporary visual culture. 2, to analyze the cultural work of these representations produced, how these representations produce hegemonic structures and narratives that impact socially and politically relevant discourses of digitalization, and what ethical evaluations of technology they generate. And 3, to identify how science and technology is communicated translocally, especially comparing the US with Europe to better address social anxieties around digital technologies. And I realize the UK is kind of in between, because they do have more US-centric ethical values and representations in culture. All right, and lastly, it will take place in 3 different phases, each oriented towards one specific aspect. Phase 1 will extend the corpus that I have already assembled and help me review all the imaginaries in digital and contemporary film. In this phase, a tagging system will help to clarify the grouping of imaginaries. The second phase will consist of the analysis work, which defines the cultural work done by the images. And lastly, in the third phase, the representations will be evaluated for their impact as science communication, allowing for a comparative view with actual SciComm in the field. As output for the project, I'm planning a monograph, obviously, several peer-reviewed articles, and a sort of white paper, possibly, that might allow stakeholders in science communication to use science fiction by commission, for example, to better address public anxieties about a specific technology. And that is also where I see the biggest potential for the project, kind of as an extension, to extend the theoretical research into artistic practice and to allow the results from the study to filter back out into the creative world. And for example, it's science fiction authors and filmmakers. I've done a similar thing with the Future Work project. So there is a trajectory where you could go. Since this is not the purview of the DFG, I've not yet addressed this, but it might be feasible to get further funding for this from bodies such as the BMBF, and apply for the for an application of results. But that might just be dreaming about the future, which is very apt for science fiction, and thus my final statement. Thank you very much. All right.